We're back talking about the Newlywed Game. You mentioned for the dating game about the writers that you had scripting questions. What was the writing staff like on the Newlywed Game coming up with questions?
They were basically the same. I mean, we had specific writers for the dating game and specific writers for the Newlywed Game. And you know, these guys just wrote questions and questions and questions and questions for the contestants.
Would they base them on any particular events or things that were going on in
no, I think they were based on getting the proper answer, the funniest answer out. Like we would ask a question: where does the sun come up in your bedroom? And they would say east, and it was to get a laugh.
Right. And a lot of times, as you said, you would get some answers that maybe were unexpected.
Yes.
And your shows are known for their spontaneity. How, as a producer, would you manage that spontaneity, keeping the right amount in, but also keeping the ball rolling?
Well, I would check the questions constantly and check the dating game questions, the Newlywed Game questions, and because those two shows were incredibly good for our company. So I would keep an eye on them constantly, to see that they stayed, as funny as they could.
When an unforeseen even breakup happened, for example, what's the most unusual place you've ever made love? Would happen, and its infamous answer, which I might let you give. How would you handle that?
I would just laugh. I would fall over my director laughing, and I stood behind him most of the time, and I would just drop over on his shoulders, and that was how I handled it.
Would it require a cut at any point if everybody's cracking up? Or?
No.
And do you remember that particular moment that I just mentioned, the anecdote?
Yes, I do very well.
Tell me about that.
Well, I just fell apart.
Tell me the answer and how you fell apart. You remember the answer?
Yes, I remember it, in the butt bath.
Yeah.
And I fell over.
Can you tell me about working with the director and producer Bill Carruthers?
Bill Carruthers, I found he came to me for a job. He was working, I think, in North America, doing television work for them. But Bill and I had a strange relationship when we marched against Bill Carruthers with when the Vietnam War was going on. Bill wanted the war to go on, and I was for ending it, and we marched in a circle around their building. We were in two different buildings, but Bill came dressed as a stormtrooper in one in a Halloween party after we weren't working anymore together.
Stormtrooper as a Nazi stormtrooper?
Yes.
Okay.
But so Bill and I had our differences, but he was great. He was a good director, and we just had our differences. That's all.
When did you first realize how popular the Newlywed Game had become?
That's hard to say. I never realized that at the time. I think I knew it was a successful show because of the ratings and so forth, but I didn't know that it would be as popular as it turned out to be.
Did you have couples clamoring to come on? I mean, maybe that would be one way you'd know if you had so many people.
Oh, we had tons of people turn out to get on to try out for the Newlywed Game, just tons. So that was a good indication of where we were going.
And you talked about before how you vetted them, so you did make sure they were married and
Oh,
newly
yes,
married?
yes,
And
yes.
what other kinds of things?
Well,
about them?
they had to have a marriage certificate, and it had to be less than a year, and those were the things that we were looking for.
Were there any issues of age in terms of limits on either end?
No, not really. We would have shows in which the four couples were elderly, and then we would have shows where the couples were very young, but that's how we handled that subject.
And I was also going to ask if there were any considerations of race. I know that there were diverse couples in terms of there were black couples and there were Latin couples. Were there ever mixed couples? Was that a concern?
Well, I don't know if we had mixed couples back then, but we never bothered with race on any of our shows. That was never something that I would enter into.
And even in a time like the 60s where it was a very tumultuous issue.
Big issue.
Sure. With both shows on the air, you have two popular shows on the air at the time. How did that change your life?
Well, I just wrote a book about my daughter, Della, and Simon & Schuster published it, and it's out now. But she would come down to the studios and be part of the shows, and I just I found it very exciting times for me.
I would imagine that, as if she was born in 1962, that she was really just barely a toddler or barely in school.
Yeah, she was 5 or 6 or something like that. And when she was 6, my wife and I divorced, and my wife, Della's mother, took her to Switzerland, and they left the country.
But I can imagine on visits, you would be a really fun dad to have a show that has never mind, it's a glamorous TV show, but it's got the amazing set, and it's got fun music, and it's got people asking funny questions. I would imagine that made you a popular dad to visit.
I was. I think I was.
Did it affect your life in terms of your finances? Were you able to have a better house, or maybe not just the motorcycle anymore, but a better car?
Well, yeah, I did well with those shows on the air. I just had a motorcycle because I like driving a motorcycle, but I bought my first car, and that it was just a great time for me.
What were both the good and bad parts about being a successful game show producer at ABC?
Well, there really wasn't any bad parts about it because I wasn't on the air. So I was behind the scenes, and I didn't have the problems I had when I did the Gong Show. Which
being recognized.
We'll talk about, yeah.
Okay. So you could still live your everyday life?
Everything. It's just the way it was.
Where did the phrase "making whoopee" come from?
We were censored constantly. We couldn't say God. We couldn't say toilet seat. We couldn't say make love. So we created our own vocabulary, and that's how we came to make whoopee. Where was the strangest place you made whoopee? So.
Cribbed from Cole Porter, I would imagine.
I'm sorry?
Taken from the song, "Making Whoopee"?
No, not at all.
Okay.
It was just a phrase.
Okay. And how much input did ABC have about the show?
Well, their only input was critical. If we were going overboard in some direction or other, they would step in and talk to us about it. But they would talk to me about it, and I would implement whatever their thoughts were.
What kind of direction would they sometimes say would be too much? Would it be, we talked about censorship, but would it be in terms of subject matter or?
Yes, it would be. It would be in that area particularly.
It would be too sexy or too.
Maybe. The times were sexy.
Right.
And so if they talked to me about that, I would get usually very angry about it and stomp around or do something, you know.
And would you get your way if you stomped around? I mean, how much push and pull did you have?
I was alone. I mean, they didn't bother me at all. I had carte blanche, you know.
Okay. What are some of your most memorable moments from the Newlywed Game?
Well, you know.
I knew it would be that one, but
yeah. Well, and I don't recall the others really. I don't remember the memorable moments other than that.
Okay. Did you ever hear feedback from couples who had problems or even divorced after the show?
Yeah, you know, we had the same divorce rate as the country, 50%, and I just took it in stride. I mean, we knew about certain couples that were divorced, but that was their problem. I didn't know how to do it.
Do you think you contributed to it, to the divorce? Did they fight after the show and say, "I can't believe you got that wrong"?
Well, they may have done that, and I remember a psychologist and his wife came on the show, and the psychologist came up to me after the show, or a psychiatrist, I forget which, and they complained about the show, and I couldn't understand, you know, their complaints. They did the show, they tried out for it, so you know, where was I to blame?
Sour grapes, maybe.
Maybe.
You did a dating game and a Newlywed Game. I'm surprised it didn't dawn on you to do the divorcee game.
Well, you know, the divorce wasn't a great subject in that time. We thought about it, but the subject matter wasn't, you know, good.
It was somewhat taboo. Still,
well, I don't think we would have gotten a lot of laughs out of that show, you know.
Now, did the primetime version of the Newlywed Game come about in the same way as the dating game?
Yes.
So, were they always companions? Did they start at the same time?
Yes. No, they didn't start at the same time.
Okay.
One started in 65, one started in 66. But they...
Well, no, but I mean the nighttime version. Was it 68 for
yes,
both?
they both started at the same time.
Okay.
And, but they were just companion pieces, that's all.
Okay, and they were both 1968, I believe. Why do you think that again, couples, as opposed to the singles that we talked about before, would be so eager to come on the show and really now be airing personal stuff about their marriages?
I have no idea. I mean, I just couldn't get over that they would do that and not have any restraints on what either one said. I always thought that the couples that did the Newlywed Game weren't really in love with each other, because if they had been in love with each other, I don't think they would have ever done that game. You know, so that was my feeling on the Newlywed Game.
Do you think there was any correlation between how well couples knew each other on the game and how well they survived in real life? I mean, maybe there's a negative correlation. Maybe if they were too anal about knowing each other's, you know, the real answers, maybe there was something wrong.
Well, you know, I couldn't judge that, but my feelings still, you know, existed about that show.
About the contestants on the show,
Yeah,
and there being something
that's
wrong with
right.
them to come on.
Yeah.
Were there ever couples that you felt were really trying to, first of all, either cheat or to beat the system to prove something about themselves that, you know?
No, I don't think so. I think that game was foolproof. I mean, they just had to answer a question, and how could they cheat doing that?
Well, if they had a code, right, or an inflection, if they had arranged something beforehand.
It was tough. It was tough to arrange something beforehand on the Newlywed Game. I just have to tell you that.
And the prizes, you know, the prizes are, even in the day, you know, a washer dryer is exciting if you want one, but they were relatively modest. Is there a reason for keeping the prices modest?
Yes, definitely, because if we had a boat, they would kill each other. They would kill each other for their wrong answers. I mean, I can't imagine, or a car. They would do the same thing. They would strangle one another, if they had a wrong answer.
But these days, exploitative producers would want them to kill each other on the air. They'd deliberately put the boat out there.
We couldn't do it back then. I mean, I didn't want that. I just wanted a nice game show.
Were there any technical difficulties with either show, Dating Game or Newlywed Game, that you remember encountering?
No.
Can you tell me about working with some of your announcers, like Charlie O'Donnell and Johnny Jacobs?
Oh, Johnny Jacobs was great. Charlie O'Donnell was good too. They both were great guys, and I loved working with them. Johnny Jacobs stayed with me for a long, long time, and he was a wonderful guy.
What about Charlie O'Donnell? Do you remember him?
Charlie O'Donnell came from the Dick Clark show. I mean, and Charlie was a great guy too. I never had trouble with them.
I believe that Johnny Jacobs in one of your later shows went in front of the camera as a host. Is that true?
No.
No? Okay.
No.
So they stayed in their positions as announcer? Okay.
Yes.
How long did the Newlywed Game last? I believe 1974 was that?
I don't remember.
Okay. Do you remember why it was canceled?
No, I just think it just outlived its stay on television.
At some point, is there nothing more to ask about Newlyweds, or does the novelty wear off? Or?
No. We went into syndication after we got off the network, so we still had questions galore.
Was it difficult to see? I mean, I know that you had syndication coming, so maybe it made it easier, but was it difficult to see the show end?
Yes. That was a big problem. I lost 4 shows at one time,
what were the 4?
I don't remember. The Dating Game and Newlywed Game. I just don't remember.
Okay.
But we had something called a parade. When a visitor from the network would come into our offices, we had this huge parade that would pass by him, and we had all the flags of the shows. And the day that man came up, the vice president came to the offices, was the day he canceled the 4 shows. So we paraded in front of him first, and then he canceled our shows.
And then you parade again with the flags at half-mast. In 1977, I believe it was, so about 3 years later, the Newlywed Game came back in syndication. How did that come about?
We just sold it, that's all. We just went around and sold the Newlywed Game. We almost sold it across the Monday through Friday at 5 o'clock, which would have been a huge thing for us, but we didn't get that.
So what time period did you get, day part?
We got the rest of the day, in the morning, in the afternoon, stuff like that.
So depending upon the station?
Yeah.
Okay, as opposed to a uniform 5 o'clock?
Yeah.
With, I guess they call that prime access?
Yeah, that's
okay.
right.
Whose idea was it to say, though, that the show had more life left in it and we can sell this in syndication?
Well, we started, I think it's safe to say that I started syndication because we had a show that we did for NBC, a pilot that we did called The Parent Game. And the network sent over 2 men to question me about my, whatever they had in mind to question me about. And that's what they were doing during that time. And these 2 guys questioned me and then went back and reported to the network that I wasn't a reliable producer for some reason or other. And so they didn't, the Parent Game was definitely going to air, but when these 2 guys came back and reported this, the parent game was dropped. And I spent a year trying to find out why the parent game was dropped. And I went to the networks and never got a satisfying answer. And I think that the reason was because they thought that I had improperly put people on the dating game that shouldn't have been there. And I couldn't quite understand it at all.
Shouldn't have been there in terms of
I don't know.
They thought it was a scandal payoff casting couch. I mean, something crazy.
I haven't any idea. Okay. But so we took the parent game and sold it into syndication across the country, and I think that was one of the first times a show like a game show went into syndication on a first run basis.
Was there a syndication model at all before that? I mean, had people, because you have to sell it to 200 something markets individually.
Yes, I know, but there wasn't a model out there. This was the first, and it was, half hour, first run, instead of Lassie or whatever
Right.
they were playing at the time, and I think that was the beginning of syndication.
First run syndication.
Yeah.
Since we mentioned the parrot game, can you tell me the format of it?
Yeah. We had parents and a kid, and the kid would ask the parent. The kids would something I don't remember the format of the parent game, but there was a format. I guarantee you.
So let's go back to, we were talking about the syndicated Newlywed Game. Your involvement, I believe, was lesser in that. Did you turn over producing duties to someone else?
No, never.
Okay, Mike Metzger, was he?
Mike Metzger was my producer, but I was executive producer,
Okay.
so I was over him.
Were you or he more day to day? Did anything change in terms of your involvement?
Well, I remember that I went to Europe for a while to write a book or something, and I went to Saint-Tropez, and I was there for about 3 or 4 or 5 weeks, and Metzger was running the Newlywed Game for me, and I heard all sorts of strange things, that he was pairing up strange couples. I don't remember exactly what the problem was, but I called him from Saint-Tropez and fired him, and but then he came back and worked for me again.
On the same show, or you mean later?
No, later. And that was a strange situation.
Well, in Bob Eubank's book, he talks about how there were changes made in that period, in the syndicated period, that he called it giving contestants a spin in the sleaze cycle. He talked about how he thought that the show changed to push limits of good taste. Is that what you think changed during that time?
That may have been what Mike was doing during that time, but when I came back, it went back to what it was, and I think Mike had been using strange couples, like, and it just didn't work. So
it sounds like some damage was done to the brand, though, in that you lost a couple of big sponsors like Ford and Procter & Gamble.
I didn't know that.
Okay. I mean, how did the show do in the ratings in that syndication? It went from 77 to 80. Was it a hit for a while? Did it trail off? Do you remember, like, the reaction?
No, I don't remember what happened in syndication.
Okay. And then again, in 1984 to 1989, it was back again in syndication. Was that with you executive producing?
No.
Okay. So that was, you turned it over, the format, to someone else?
Yeah.
Who
Well,
ran it?
I sold my company.
Okay.
And Sony eventually bought it, and I think Sony produced that Newlywed Game.
Okay. And then yet another revival of the Newlywed Game now with on Game Show Network with Carney Wilson.
That probably is what the Sony people have done.
Okay, so you haven't seen it?
No.
Do you think that the show could still be relevant in 2010?
Of course, yeah. I think it would. But then again, I'm partial to that show.
What kind of changes would you just predict would be good to make it relevant to modern audiences? Obviously, our tastes are a little different. Technology is different.
Well, I don't know if I would make any changes, and that's probably bad because I think changes should be made these days. But I don't know if my shows are so dated that they wouldn't be able to perform now.
It's true. It is about human nature, right? So
Yeah.
that never changes, really. And now, of course, we get to another really big show for you, The Gong Show, 1976. What was the show? Tell me the format, and then we'll talk about how it came about.
Well, the American Broadcasting Company, I forget whether it was ABC or NBC or CBS. I think it must have been ABC, but I went to them and tried to sell them on the idea that we needed a great talent show. I mean, a good talent show. There weren't any venues. There weren't any, entertainment shows that would use acts, and most of the nightclubs were closed. And so I went out to look for good acts, and I just found terrible acts. So I came back and said to them, let's change the show. Let's have all, bad acts, and then we'll have one or two good ones so that people can make a judgment. And they bought it because at that time...
Who was they? Who bought it?
I forget who, ABC or NBC or CBS.
It was NBC.
It was NBC bought it. Oh, that's right, Marilyn David. She was vice president at the time. And they bought the show and put it on daytime. I wasn't the host. There was a different host. And I think it was Gary Edwards or Gary something. And he was a good host, but I kept auditioning the acts, and they would get to know me, and I thought that was a good thing to be on the show with them, and as it turned out, I don't think that was the best idea. I think I would have been more surprised if I came on the show and saw the act performing. But so I decided to take over the hosting job, and I did. And I wore a tux to start out with, and all these fine stuff. And soon I began to take off the tie and take off and put on another kind of jacket and wear a hat.
And the hat got lower right over the eyes.
But that was a reason. I was scared to death of the audience, so I just didn't want to see them. So I wore this hat low over my eyes. But and then I took over the show.
Now, did the show air with that original host before you took over the show?
Yes.
For how long? Do you remember?
About a year.
About a year, okay. When you originally wanted to make it an actual good talent show, were you inspired by, for example, Arthur Godfrey and some of the long history of real talent shows out there?
Yes, I was. I thought that they were a staple that was missing from television.
And you're right, because here today we have America's Got Talent, and they're back, right? They're back in a real way. But nothing ever like The Gong Show with its bad talent. Did you have any kind of on-camera or performing experience before you did take it over?
No.
So,
no, I just knew what the show needed. We had a host who tried out for the program and had absolutely no idea about the Gong Show. I mean, when J.P. Morgan would tell an act that gonged an act and said because of the socks that the act was wearing, this host got,
This is the original
livid.
guy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this original host got livid, and he said, "These are people. Why is she saying that?" And I said, "That's perfect. That's a perfect answer for this show." And so I had to try somebody else out, and I tried one of the writers, and I was telling him that that's not the way to do it. This is the way to do it in front of Marilyn David, and she insisted that I do the show. So she said, either you do it or I'm going to replace it. So I did it. I went that night to a restaurant, and I thought about it all night long. Figuring all the changes that would take place in my life, but I never got it right. I mean, I never figured the changes out the way I eventually figured them out.
Right, well, we'll get to that. I believe that original host who was uncomfortable or didn't kind of get that original format was John Barber.
Yes.
Who went on to Real People, I believe, on NBC
Yeah.
shortly thereafter. Would you consider The Gong Show almost, in what it became, a spoof of a real variety show? Would that be the right word, a parody maybe of a variety show?
I'm not sure what the Gong Show was. It may have been, but I don't know.
How did you differ in your vision of the show's format from either the network at times, or I know you had a producer, Chris Beard, who had some different thoughts about it. What were the differences?
I don't remember the differences. I just know that I know what I wanted, and that's all I know.
Did the network, do you think, did they get the joke? Were they in on the joke from the beginning?
I think they were. I really do think they were, and I think that it was the end of the show. It came because of me. I think that I had some kind of a small nervous breakdown out there, doing strange things. When I see films of the last shows, I was walking around busting up flats on the air, and that was not the behavior of a host. That was the behavior of a host who was bored to death, who was ratcheting up his performances, every year, and that wasn't good.
And I believe that's something that I've read about you, that you would advise other game show hosts exactly not to do. Before you became a host yourself, you would tell people not to go over the top.
No, that's right. I think the shows that are high intensity shows are gone from the air. I think that the shows that are calmer, the Perry Comos, the Andy Williams, stuff like that, they stay around for a long time.
Do the other ones, I guess, burn brightly and burn out too fast and wear out their welcome?
Yeah, I do. I'm a perfect example of that.
How did you handle both producing and hosting at the same time?
Well, I would conduct the auditions, and nowadays, I'm sad that I didn't put our auditions on the air, because that's something everybody does now. But our audition, I conducted our auditions. I wanted to make, first of all, there was a first line of defense. Auditions were at another place with two guys running them, and then they would send the best acts
or the worst acts.
Or the worst acts, yes, exactly, to me, and I would look at them Monday through Friday, and see what they were, and then we would pick out 60 or some and go to the studio, and then plot the shows. We would have rehearsals from 9 o'clock to 4 or 5 o'clock, and pick the acts that would be on the shows, and then we would have an hour off and to get dressed and put on makeup, and then go out and perform the show.
Were there a certain number of acts that you knew you would need per show? Because, for example, if somebody gets gonged right in the beginning, you can't predict how long their act is going to actually play. So would you need to have, a variable number of acts booked for each show, or how did it work?
Well, we had, I remember the number 60. I think we would take that. And we would use, an act would have to be on for 45 seconds before it got gonged.
Okay.
And then we would do five shows Saturday and 5 shows Sunday, and by the evening of Sunday, I would be exhausted, and somebody would invariably have to drive me home.
Well, I know a lot of game shows that still produce that way. To get through the day, I think some of the people, to loosen up, have a couple of drinks. Would that be the case in the Gong Show? Would we see people get looser through the week because the day got looser?
No, I was never on drugs, but everybody thought I was. When they saw the Gong Show and I would come out, they all thought I was whacked out of my mind. But I never did drugs. I had a public company. I had lots of television shows on the air. I had a daughter who was a druggie, who I could see an example, and I had no use for drugs at all. So I never did it. But I was excessive, and my daughter was excessive, and we chewed gum by the packs and stuff like that. But I never drank on the show or ever had drugs.
When you talked about that first line of defense for finding the acts for the show, where exactly would you go, or where would your producers go to find bad acts? How do you do that?
Well, the Gong Show never had, never was at a loss for bad acts. They would flock into this restaurant that I had bought, and
what was the restaurant?
It was on Cahuenga. I don't remember the name, but the acts would come in there, and these two guys would tape them, and let them perform, and they'd send the tapes to an associate producers, and they would look at the tapes and bring the people back. That I think they would look at the tapes on a Monday, and we would see them Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and Friday, and we made the choices.
What do you think made people flock to Cahuenga? And in other words, were they in on the joke that was supposed to be bad, or did they think they were good? I mean, how aware were people? Why did they want to come on the show?
Most of them thought they were bad, but the show had several acts that were good. So some acts would come in that were good, and we would use them as good acts, and the other acts, would be judged accordingly. But the good acts, never won as much as they should have. The bad acts, there was usually one very weird act, and that act would win.
Do you think that people would come on almost to get gonged as a badge of honor, or just to interact with the panelists? I mean, what would be the reasoning for being so bad on television?
Well, that's hard to say. Murray Langston, the unknown comic, wore a bag on his head because he didn't want other comics to know that he was doing the Gong Show, and he was extremely funny as the unknown comic. And he did an act later in Vegas, and he did the first half of the act with a bag on his head, and he would take the bag off and perform the other way. And he was much funnier with the bag on his head.
And you mentioned the unknown comic. You had so many other recurring acts. Well, first of all, let's talk about, I believe your own mother was on the show.
Well, yes, my mother was on the show. I introduced her as my mother, and she came out and sang "Ain't She Sweet" or something like that. And then I had a policeman come in, and first of all I said, "You're not allowed to be on the show. You're my mother." And I had a policeman came in and dragged her off, and she kept singing all the time that she went off.
So you said you inherited being a ham from your parents. Was your mother a ham? What would make her want to do it otherwise?
She must have been a ham. My daughter was a ham. We were all hams.
Is it satisfying to have your mother dragged off by policemen?
Yes. Her it was.
What about some of the other, as I said, recurring acts? And I'll name some, like Gene the Dancing Machine.
Oh, he was great. Gene was a stagehand. And
what's his real name?
It is Gene Raymond, I think, or something like that. And he swept up the stage, and while he swept, he was doing this great little dance. So I said, Gene, come out and do the dance. And he did, and it was a huge success. I mean, when we would go out to the ball games together watch the Dodgers, Gene would get a bigger hand than I got, when they saw him, and they just loved him.
In the format of the show, how would it work that acts could recur? How could people be on more than once and compete more than once? How did that happen? It
didn't. They weren't allowed to repeat themselves, except Pee Wee Herman, who always came on the show as a different act. I mean, in disguise. Like he was an Indian, he was a preacher, and on and on.
But it was Pee Wee as an Indian, and
Pee
Wee as a preacher, not Paul Rubens as these characters. Yeah,
Pee Wee Herman, but it was Paul Rubens,
right? But
really.
Doing Pee Wee, doing a character.
No, not doing Pee Wee, doing something else, and doing another act, and I kept saying, Paul, is that you? And he was, yeah. And I would ignore it. And he would go on, and he was wonderful.
What about Father Ed?
Father Ed was a stagehand too. We would dress him up and bring him out, and he would start talking about the wisdom of the Bible, which we would have on cue cards. And then during his talk, we would turn the cue cards upside down, and he would be totally lost. And it was just weird.
Was turning the cue cards upside down deliberately part of his shtick, or was it something you just decided to do?
No, I decided to do. and it got him all messed up.
And well, I know that a lot of his biblical advice would not be real. Right?
No. That's right.
What was his real name?
His name, I can't remember.
But anything to do with really being any kind of clergyman or anything?
No, not at all.
Not at all.
I think his name was Ed somebody or something.
Okay. And, I'm going to get to one other act that is very memorable for a lot of reasons, but first I'll ask you about censorship because it kind of leads into it. Were there problems with the censors on this show, and would you almost, I believe I've heard that you had kind of decoy acts that you would deliberately put up there?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we had a man and a woman from Standards and Practices who would come down to see all of our acts, and they would invariably cancel one act. I had no reason, I never understood why, but they would cancel one. And I couldn't see anything wrong with airing it, So I started to bring acts that they would cancel and that were totally abominable. And the two would come down and say, you can't have that act on television. So I would say, okay, and get rid of it. And I brought one act down, the Popsicle Twins, and I don't know where the censors were. They may have stepped out and had a cigarette. But the Popsicle Twins came out and performed, and everybody, the stagehands that were sweeping up, stopped sweeping and just looked at them. They couldn't believe their eyes.
Well, explain what the Popsicle
Well,
Twins
the
was.
Popsicle Twins were two teenagers, 17 and
Girls.
Yes, two teenage girls, 17 and 18, who came out and sat down on the stage, and our band would play, some little autumn thing, and they would take out these two popsicles and just give them
Fillet them.
fillet them. And I couldn't get over it. So we aired them, and I got called immediately into the president of NBC's office, and I happened to be doing a lollipop at the time, and I walked in, and he said, "I want ratings, not cocksuckers." And I thought we were going to be canceled, for sure, and that was a stupid mistake.
Well, were there other examples that they did catch? I presume the Popsicle Twins were intended to be a decoy then, to use that word.
Yes.
Were there any examples of other ways that the network tried to ask either you and your performance as host, or in terms of what the acts were, to tone it down or change it?
Well, we had an act called Scarlet and Red, Scarlet and Red, which was a wardrobe person and a makeup person who came out together and did things like Hickory Dickory Dock, the mouse ran up the clock struck 12, and the mouse shit. And then we blooped it. We would bloop that word. And so eventually their act became more and more using more curse words,
Vulgar, profane.
Profanity, in constant things. And I think that's, they were total bloops. And I think the standards and practices people always had problems with our show.
But did they have the power, for example, to make you not book them anymore, or not book other people
No,
anymore?
they didn't do that.
What acts did you have when you talked about that there were some good acts that were deliberately peppered in there? What ones, and were there any that you gave their start by going on to fame?
Well, we had a singer that supposedly went on to other things, but I don't remember her name, and of course Pee Wee Herman, but I don't think we should even take credit for that. I think he did it on his own. There were a few others, but most of the acts, were bad.
I want to talk about some of your panelists and your judges, and then talk about the reaction to the show. But you mentioned J.P. Morgan. She did some outrageous stuff. I believe that she had a breast-bearing incident.
Yes, she did. But that was probably my fault. I was in a frenzy that day, and she at the end of in the last act of the show, she stood up and undid her blouse and bared her breasts
To the camera or to the audience?
to the camera, and I couldn't get over that, and I think that was basically my fault, because I think I was just at an all-time high as far as my performance is concerned. But
how did you deal with that, and then what were the repercussions?
Well, JP couldn't do the show anymore, as she was banned from the show.
By the network?
By the network.
Okay.
And I just suffered the loss of her, because when she was one of the judges, I was very secure. I felt very secure. But we had Artie Johnson, and the guy with the big nose,
Jamie Farr.
And they were great. They also would give me great shows. But we had a lot of other people. We had one of the Andrews sisters, and we had David Letterman, who never admits to it, and and we had a lot of good people.
Some other names, Rex Reed.
Yes, Rex Reed was hated when he did the show, but he was great.
Hated because he was too tough on the axe.
Yes.
And Pat Harrington.
Oh yeah, Pat Harrington was great. We, Pat and I were together at NBC way back, and he was an old friend.
Phyllis Diller.
Oh yeah, Phyllis Diller was just great. She was always good. She always had something great to say.
Great in terms of critical and funny, or
no, funny, just funny. She was the funniest person alive.
And Scatman Crothers.
Oh yeah, Scatman Crothers. I don't even remember that Scatman, but I'm sure he was good.
And I talked about, in all of your shows, we've talked about the critical response. I know that the critical response here was particularly harsh. I want to talk about it in different ways. First, for your hosting skills, what were the critics' reaction to your hosting?
It was generally all bad, and the critics would write me letters about my performance in the show, and I would read them on the air. And
the letters would say stuff like what?
Well, they would say how bad I was and how bad the show was, and so that critic would just despise me from that point on, and but it got to such a crucial point that it really messed me up.
By the way, I didn't ask you what time slot you had on NBC. Was this a prime time or prime access or daytime?
We were in daytime and nighttime on the three networks, all three. I don't remember where the positioning was, but I know that when we were on NBC and then we left and we went to ABC and we left and we went to CBS and left,
All within the space of just a few years.
Yeah.
The show was on from 1976 to 1980, I believe. So
Yeah.
just 4 years and 3 networks?
Yeah.
One critic, for example, called you the Ayatollah of Trasharola. I know that was, certainly during the Ayatollah Khomeini period, so that name was in the news, but it was a reaction to the entire show. And you said, that really messed you up. Why did you stick with the show with such harsh criticism?
What was I to do? I wasn't going to run immediately, but I eventually did. I eventually just... I think the ratings went down, and then I quit and went to Europe.
So that's the reason why the show ended after 4 years. It was your choice in this case.
No, I think that the show went down in the ratings. I think that was mostly because of me. I think that I was too intense, and then I think that the show just went off the air.
Did you think when you had enough? Did you think of keeping the show on, but maybe with another host?
No, never thought of that.
And why is that?
Well, I thought I was great.
What do you think made people watch the show for 4 years? What was the appeal to seeing bad acts?
I just think that everybody, could relate to somebody wearing a lampshade and dancing around. Bad acts are inherent in everyone, and I think that that was what kept the show afloat.
Do you remember, when you would get feedback, say from people on the street, what would be their demographic? Was it like young, cool kids who got the joke? Who watched this show?
Everybody watched the show. There wasn't an age demarcation at all. And the strangest people remember, they have to be over 40 to remember that show. And but I'm happy when they do.
You talked about too how here was an end of your anonymity since now you were on camera. How did that affect your personal life? Could you go out on the town?
It affected me immensely. I mean, I was at an Army football game, and I had to leave the stadium because everybody was getting to me, and I couldn't get a breakfast at a lunch counter anymore. I couldn't stand in line for a movie. All of those things bothered me a lot, and I wasn't a very. I would do it differently now, if I could. I mean, I would be more appreciative of the people, but they still bother me, and so I don't know, what I'm accomplishing, but it was tough.
Well, with your wacky on-air persona, would people not just recognize you, but want to do weird stuff too, or with you?
Yes, on airplanes, people would come over to me and get down on their knees and do a lizard, I why is that person bothering me, and things like that. I mean, people would audition on the street.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, they would do all sorts of animal things and comedic things, and I really didn't have any. I didn't really want that.
And the Gong Show, of course, as we said, it ended on NBC in 1978 and syndication in 1980. But in the meanwhile, there was the Gong Show movie.
Yeah, that's
How did
right.
that come about?
Columbia Pictures did the Gong Show movie, and it was. I think that was a disgraceful movie. I mean, it may have some kind of cult following now, but when I went to see it, it opened on a weekend, and I had seen the night before a review of it on a CBS station, and the guy held up a garbage can and hit it with a hammer, and I thought that was a bad omen. But when I went to the theater, and I caught it like a 12:30 show, and I walked in, and the ticket taker said to me, "You're not going to like this one." And it lasted the weekend, and it disappeared.
Was it shot on the set of the Gong Show? I mean, how did it?
No, it was all over the place, and the first half of the movie was good. I think but then I took it to a more serious level, and I think that was a huge mistake.
Well, when you say I took it to a more serious level, were you involved as writer? Or?
Yes, I wrote the script.
Okay.
I directed it.
And appeared, right?
And appeared in it, and so forth and so on. So. Did
the rest of the Gong Show regular cast, in terms of judges and whatever, appear?
They appeared throughout the movie, in segments of the Gong Show. But when we did the Gong Show for our test audience, we did it at USC in front of 1,500 students. And when Della, my daughter, came on, they booed 1,500 students. I mean, the booing was profound, and it had a big effect on my daughter. She ran out of the theater and found her crying.
She was only, I believe that was in the beginning, so she was only about 14 at the time?
Yeah, that's right.
When you said Della came on, I had forgotten to ask you. She came on, I believe, to introduce you. There was a tradition on the Gong Show of celebrities introducing you.
Yeah.
So each episode, how would you recruit a celebrity? Again, it'd have to be someone who was in on the joke. to come on and
Well,
introduce you?
I would get, Carol Burnett introduced me, Steve Martin introduced me, and performed on the show. And my daughter eventually, and waitresses introduced me from Nate and Al's and stuff like that. But when my daughter started introducing me, it had a different, she dressed and revered J.P. Morgan, so she dressed like J.P. Morgan, used makeup like J.P. Morgan, which was a big mistake. I think it was a big mistake for me to have put her on, but I made a lot of mistakes. So I turned her. That's what she did.
We're going to end there and start with some other stuff.
Oh, great.